and incentivize and change the conversation away from just being about whether you can control this entity or that entity, and making it more of a virtuous circle in terms of unleashing economic incentives and empowering and helping to empower local communities push back against some of the worst excesses of the armed groups.
Thank you for that. So finally, I just wanted, at the last snapshot question, and I've noticed in the report, you said in all three cities, Misrata, Zintan, and Zawiya, the residents all voiced some concern of an outbreak of national level violence. So with that political and economic sort of outlook that you provide, and you have these snapshots there, but you obviously follow the broader security situation. We've had outbreaks of violence in Tripoli, you've had crackdowns in Benghazi as fairly recently. What do you think is the probability of a further national level violence, because it obviously will play into any plans we have for DDR?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that these are the perceptions of the community members, so those perceptions are coloured by previous rounds of conflict, and many of these communities have paid the price of those conflicts in terms of lost family members, lost sons, damage, things that still haven't been put right. We're talking about reconstruction in Derna. There are a whole bunch of places that have been devastated by conflict in Libya that have had little to no reconstruction take place. But it's clear that the dynamics that we see, which is a kind of Hobbesian power struggle for direct extraction of resources, is more likely to result in an outbreak of further conflict, because the one mechanism that the state has developed to deal with that is to basically parcel out more resources, and that they're finite. Particularly on the northwest coast, though, where that monetization of territory is so critical in terms of controlling routes, you can see that actually there's quite a high potential for further significant outbreaks of fighting there. And we've seen over the course of this year drone strikes in Zawiya by the GNU, claiming to target criminal elements, but it happened to be the areas which were controlled by the groups which were antagonistic to the GNU. We're seeing Zawiya refinery come in the crosshairs. So I think that's likely to be the face of ongoing fighting. It's likely to be battles over those kind of parochial interests. That being said, you can also see a scenario in which, in the efforts to create a new technocratic government, would invert the commas over that technocratic part, there's going to be a negotiation in the security sector, and you've got a large, like the preponderance of the Zintani security sector on the outside looking in terms of the state. You've got the Abu Humaira, who are very antagonistic as well. You've got ambitious central Zawiya axis. So we're constantly seeing these limits being tested. And also this year, it's worth noting that we saw quite significant fighting in a civilian area between Tripoli-based armed groups. So it seems a bit more difficult to envisage a LAF attempt to something being replicated like Haftar's attempt to take over Tripoli. But I think sometimes the lack of country-wide fighting has been perceived as stability from the outside, but this is really inherently not stable. And there isn't a conversation around these things which are very closely wedded to issues like DDR that's taking place that's credible, in my view.
So now I'll leave it to the audience to talk specifically. We've got some DDR experts in IFC here, and several friends and colleagues. So yes, we'll just take hands now. I think there's a mic coming around.
First of all, fantastic. I mean, I really, flipping through the report and hearing you speak, this really needed to be written. It's just a wonderful, and I'm thinking sort of Clifford Geertz. We needed an ethnography of Libyan militias with case studies to really dig into what all the issues are. And I love the choice of cases because of the way they contrast. There's an ethnic side of this which you sort of hinted at in Zintan that I wondered if you could comment on, the whole Berber side of this, and I don't know if it's in the report. There's also armed groups prior to 2011. I don't know if you looked into that, but like in Ronan's book, the drug gangs, the RevComs, I was wondering if you could comment about the pre-revolutionary militias and how that fit into this. And let's call it, to keep the question short, traumas, right? The trauma of Gaddafi, the trauma of the Civil War, the trauma of the 2014, the 2011 revolution, the 2014, the assault in 2019. I mean, there's two aspects. When I think of militias, it's partially the embeddedness in the local context, which you're absolutely right about, and maybe that is the most important thing. But it's also the revolutionary posture of most of them, and it's the protection of the community against those fears, almost explaining to some degree why the Zawiyans are so nervous about even talking about it, right? That ties back to those traumas. I mean, Zawiya is one of the most understudied sites of the massacres of 2011, which the story still hasn't been told except that short documentary that was locally produced. So three other little things you can just respond to if you want to. You may remember that crisis group with Small Arms Survey did that survey in 2012, taxonomizing the militias into four groups: revolutionary, post-revolutionary, and then the small ones, the illegals and the jihadist. The third and fourth category being really small. I was wondering if that kind of played into your thinking, because the post-revolutionary versus the revolutionary is really important. The second little thing you might want to respond to is we often get informal economy wrong, and I was wondering if you could distinguish between black economy and what you might call gray economy, because I think we always talk about the black side of what the militias are involved in, and not just provision of local services, and illicit but gray and necessary economic transactions, which is huge. The same Toyotas, the same, And then the last thing is, and riffing off of one of the things you said about 2/3 of the way through, what if it's just the case that DDR and SSR are impossible until you have the ultimate peace deal and the ultimate reconciliation, because these groups see themselves as Minutemen? I'm from Boston. That just defending the community until they don't need to keep those weapons anymore. What if it's just, what if we're just planning? That's fine, but planning until we have the ultimate reconciliation, and then the DDR and SSR, as you're implying through the whole talk, is an organic thing that grows out of the macro resolution, rather than thinking, as is often wrongly analyzed, that we have to kind of force things before Libya is at peace with itself.
Thank you so much. So you want to take some of those?
Yeah. Thank you. Bill, very, very good points. On the revolutionary side, I think this is an interesting one, because it's also, there's a question of what it means to be revolutionary as well, which is different in different cities. So Libya can be one of the most frustrating places to kind of draw blanket conclusions. But the experience of revolution across these different cities is very different, and the roles, as I intimated, that those cities see themselves as playing is different. And so for the Zintanis, having some accordance with the elements of the former regime was a sensible decision. That was by no means a betrayal of the revolution, but for many in Misrata that was. And I think there's a question of what it means to be revolutionary today, and I think that's even more complicated as the affiliations and the negotiations become muddier. You've got a lot of lines being crossed, particularly through illicit interests. With your point on the taxonomy of, what's a revolutionary group versus an outright criminal group versus, a more formal group, I've found that mostly impossible to distinguish when you go locally. And this may be an overly sympathetic view, but the preponderance of the groups that are focused on criminal sources of revenue are largely in the areas where there aren't as many alternative sources of revenue available. And also, the social origins of those groups tend to be from lower socioeconomic backgrounds as well. So they've gone for more direct forms of revenue generation. So in that sense, militias versus armed groups, and we've had a lot of discussion about hybridity and things like that here, but it seems to me that those local perceptions and those local understandings remain the dominant feature still. So I think you've got to engage with those and try and come up with some common goals in terms of the roles that the armed groups should play within those communities. And now, don't want to oversimplify that, in a place like Zawiya, transforming its economy is an incredibly big challenge, particularly when you don't have a national development strategy, you don't have development spending unlocked, you've got, so it's really, really difficult to see some of these things, but I do think that having that local understanding, you also mentioned about things based around ethnicity, people's understandings of what's going on are very, very localized, and this is, I think, this dilemma that you can achieve most locally, but those local balances of power might also be quite unjust to elements of the community as well. So how do you do that, and how do you do that in a way which doesn't frustrate a national process? That seems to be the main challenge. And I would just say, in terms of whether that follows a big deal, I think that these processes are so dynamic that these groups are still growing, that if you wait, it will be too late. And so I think you've got to actually try and look at changing the nature of the conversation and doing what you can while you can, accepting that there will be limits to that. And just finally, on the black and grey economy, well, yeah, so found some interesting examples of Zintani armed groups basically strong-arming people into contracts in the oil sector. Formal contracts that get audited, but very clearly there were some companies that won, and they had some connections, and the other companies did not. And so, right. There's some service provisions. So you found Zawiya and armed groups basically offering grandmothers access to banking services that they would otherwise be unable to get. But why were they able to offer that? Because they were basically dipping their finger in the bank. So, there's a lot here, and I think increasingly distinguishing as well between Libya's formal and informal black and white economies has become kind of impossible, because most economic activities seem to have an element of both, and everybody is reliant on the black market these days, which is why you see some of the biggest political discourse come around when the black market rate skyrockets, because it has such a direct impact on people straight away and what they pay for things, what they've got. So hopefully I covered some of those things.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Yes, Mona. Sorry, I have to yield to the Vice President. With two colleagues.
I'll make it very quick. Thank you so much, Tim. This was fascinating. It's a clear takeaway that it's local dynamics, hyper-local dynamics, it sounds like, that really drive an understanding of these armed groups and therefore efforts at DDR. One question that came to mind, though, as you were speaking, if it's relevant, is the role of foreign fighters. And is there an intersection between Wagner or other foreign fighters who may be on the ground? I'm not current on Libya. I don't know if there's still Syrian fighters on the ground or others. But to what extent, if at all, does that factor into your analysis? Thanks.
We'll just go one for one. I was told that's what I'm supposed to do.
Okay. It's a really good question. I think in the analysis we were doing on the LAF a while ago, this was a bigger factor, but it was notable that many people told us, for example, that Joueli's forces included a large number of mercenaries and foreign mercenaries. In these three cities, I don't see the role of foreign fighters to be particularly influential, though in each of the contexts they exist to play specific roles. Overall, I've tended to find that there's some quite slightly perverse findings that after the 2019-20 war, the presence of foreign militaries have probably helped to prevent a larger outbreak of conflict. But still, you do see foreign fighters deployed in a number of locations, and particularly with relation to the South, this is highly controversial with issues over citizenship and nationality. I think fundamentally, it's not a very good answer to your question, but where I think they come in these contexts is that it's the ability to coercively control key assets that allows these armed groups and their broader communities to benefit from the resources of the state. So as long as that remains the kind of dynamic, I think you're going to continue to see those types of actors be employed, particularly when there is a large outbreak of conflict. So Zawiya was probably using those figures because he needed to move and control further territory, and actually trying to work out just how many men at arms in each Libyan group is a very difficult thing. This isn't a military analysis at all, but it was clear that to do that he also needed to draw upon additional resources, and they used the money to pay for foreign fighters to do that. So, but I don't see them playing an autonomous role within these three cities.
Just a two-finger on that, and Chris, I'll come right to you, and I know we're running out of time, but even in the Misrata case, not foreign fighters or mercenaries, but foreign military Turkish fighters, and the ties between Misrata and Turkey for long-standing. Does that play into post-2020 security dynamics? I mean, what about that aspect of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the role of Turkey is central. If you look in Tripoli, you look at the 444, the recent outbreaks of fighting, there's a social kind of element to that in terms of these armed groups that have come out of the Tripoli suburb of Sukujuma, and Mahmoud Hamza, the head of the 444, being kind of seen as the anointed one by Turkey and getting too big for his boots, I think is the essence of why that fighting took place. But Turkey is running some of its own programming here. It is training groups, particularly groups like the 444, and there are key commanders that have had long-standing relations with Turkey and have sought to draw upon those resources to improve the equipment and training of their armed groups. I think, as I mentioned, the record of that's slightly mixed, but it's definitely a factor, and I think nobody anticipates.
But you see it mainly in the capital. It's not playing into these local dynamics of specific.
Well, bin Rajab actually has been a significant, and his and basically Namroush was one of the principal go-betweens with Turkey. So actually one of the main reasons that one of the Zawiya axes has been able to become more influential militarily is also because of that sanctioned support from Turkey. So each of these groups, as they become bigger, does need to obtain the acquiescence at least of the big players outside of the country. And so Zintanis were funded by Emiratis in 2011. Of course, got Haftar. All of these players have had foreign support at different times. They've utilized it to try and pursue their agendas.
Sure. Chris.
Hi, Chris Inman, a program on violent extremism here at USIP. I'm just curious, your last slide had a bunch of how questions, and you had done some interviews or polling, I'm not sure what, with local community members. I'm just curious if they had ideas about how to do all of those things, and also how and who of those local community members need to have a seat at the table, and how can we help ensure that they get there?
Thank you. It's a great question. Actually, I think we didn't, at the time of the community interviews, ask them how they thought the security sector should be reformed. We probably should have, to be honest. We were quite careful in some of the way we were asking those questions because these are quite sensitive dynamics, and we were quite keen that the interviews didn't make it seem like we were trying to take out armed groups. But one idea, and I think that DCAF is looking at this, and is how do you create some kind of accountability mechanism with communities, and who in the community should participate in that. Of course, you have municipal councils. But in a number of these instances, the municipal councils have basically surrogates of the armed groups. That's a challenge. I think that having some kind of interface in these cities between the communities and the armed groups that over key issues about weapons management, about codes of conduct, I think would be a thing to go that you could route to go that you could replicate across the country, and I think would work quite well. And some people that you'll get into the debate whether that should be through elders or pre-existing mediation mechanisms. I think actually it would need to be something quite different, and what you would want to target there are some approaches that could be replicated across different geographies that would create kind of like a common baseline. That seems to be the most workable way of or pushing that route, though of course there'll be challenges to that, right? The armed groups will try and penetrate a committee like that. There could be pressure placed upon them, so that's where I think there would be a strong role for the international community to support and push those types of efforts. It feels to me that there's a broad consensus or a conclusion that's been drawn by many implementers and internationals that coming up with a national SSR strategy is very difficult, and that there are more opportunities at the local level. But that now needs to be fleshed out into something a bit more strategic that can be replicated, because what I see at the moment are largely disconnected efforts looking at different things from pre-DDR to DDR to some things which are SSR related, and there needs to be some kind of common framework that connects to, and I think the centerpiece of that should be community accountability.
Well, we've run out of time. We've gone over time, but thank you so much, and thank you, Tim, for this phenomenal report. Thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary Morgado, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And I really encourage you to really read the report. It's really fascinating. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andrew.